June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. Morning heat pooling on the swells, sunlight flashing off whitecaps like broken glass. From the cockpit of an A6M50, a young ensign yanked hard right and pitched into a climbing spiral, certain the American behind him would stagger and drop. The war had taught a simple rule: lighter wing loading wins. Yet the blue fighter kept rising. The F6F Hellcat, about 2,500 pounds loaded, its Pratt Whitney R-2800 throwing roughly 2,000 horsepower, held the turn and then climbed through. 6 50-caliber Brownings raking the arc. The Zero replied with 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm guns, but energy fell away too quickly. At the top of the corkscrew, the American was still accelerating. Oil smell seeped into the slipstream, and the ensign felt the old arithmetic fail. An armored carrier fighter, outclimbing a Zero. By late morning, the sky over the Marianas was a lattice of contrails and burned fuel. Task Force 58's Combat Air Patrol rotated fresh divisions at altitude, while Japanese strikes, dispatched at long range from Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, arrived thin and fuel-starved. The Hellcat's speed, near 380 mph against the Zero's mid-340s, its armor plate and self-sealing tanks erased familiar margins. Cannon hits that once blossomed into fire now died in black smears. Vertical maneuvers that had punished Americans in 1942 suddenly belonged to them. The R-2800 always seemed to have one more handful of power. By afternoon, whatever the claims, the effect was plain. Japan's carrier air arm was gutted in hours, and with it a decade of certainty. To understand how the Hellcat stole the sky, we must return to the ruthless lessons of 1942 that shaped Grumman's answer from cowling to tail. Early 1942, Pacific horizons glowed with the rising sun and the smoke of defeat. From the Philippines to the Solomons, Allied pilots faced a machine they could neither outrun nor outturn. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, weighing barely over 5,000 pounds, could climb more than 3,000 feet per minute and stay aloft for over 1,900 kilometers without refueling, an impossible range by Western standards. In the skies over the Coral Sea, it slashed through formations of Brewster Buffaloes and F4F Wildcats, whose heavier frames and stubby wings turned the simplest dogfight into suicide. At Midway, seasoned Japanese aviators, many hardened since the late 1930s in China, fought with the precision of a practiced blade. Their planes could roll tighter, climb steeper, and pivot within turning circles no American aircraft could match. Wildcat pilots learned the cruel arithmetic of survival: never turn with a Zero. Dive and pray gravity would save you. By the time American forces dug in at Guadalcanal, the myth of the Zero had hardened into dread. Marines and naval aviators radioed descriptions of enemy fighters that could hang on their propellers, climbing almost vertically where no Wildcat could follow. Each engagement underscored a painful truth: the United States had entered the Pacific War flying relics of another era. Armor and self-sealing fuel tanks kept American pilots alive longer, but the price was speed and agility. Japan's philosophy had been opposite: strip every ounce of weight until the airframe itself seemed to vanish in the sky. The result was a predator born from fragility. Then, in June 1942, luck intervened. On Akutan Island in the Aleutians, a Zero crash-landed almost intact. Navy intelligence retrieved the wreck and shipped it to San Diego, where engineers and test pilots finally dissected Japan's secret weapon. The Akutan Zero became their blueprint, a revelation that turned humiliation into resolve. What they learned in that hangar would ignite a new design race, one that promised not just parity but dominance. The challenge was clear: build a fighter that could meet the Zero's grace and survive its guns. Bethpage, Long Island, summer 1942. Inside the hangars of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the air was thick with the smell of machine oil and fresh aluminum filings. Engineers bent over drafting tables, tracing the silhouette of a new predator meant to end the Zero's reign. The Akutan wreck had been a revelation. Its near-weightless construction and wide wings were genius, but also its undoing. "Too delicate," Leroy Grumman noted. "One burst and it folds." Alongside Chief Engineer William Schwendler, he outlined a different philosophy. Not elegance, but endurance. American pilots needed a fighter that could dive, climb, and return to the carrier riddled with holes, and still fight the next sortie. Their answer took shape as the F6F. Beneath its thick skin roared the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower twin-row radial that could lift the aircraft's 12,000-pound frame with brutal authority. The first prototype, XF6F1, flew in June 1942, but within days the team demanded more power and installed the improved R-2810, creating the XF6F3, the true Hellcat. Test pilots climbed from the cockpit with grins of disbelief. At 23,000 feet, it could reach nearly 376 miles per hour and still feel steady under fire. It could outclimb the Wildcat by hundreds of feet per minute, and unlike the Zero, it could dive hard without shedding its wings. Grumman's factory workers called it the Iron Works, and the nickname fit. The Hellcat's thick armor glass, self-sealing fuel tanks, and reinforced landing gear made it the tank of the sky. 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns gave it bite enough to shred anything airborne. By early 1943, the first squadrons trained on the F6F, trading turn fights for high-energy slashing attacks. The Hellcat embodied a new doctrine: survive first, kill second, win always. What began as America's desperate response to defeat had become the blueprint for total air superiority. The stage was set for the Pacific's turning tide. August 31, 1943, dawn over the Pacific. The carrier USS Independence steamed northeast of Marcus Island, its deck shimmering with heat and salt spray as flight crews readied the newest weapon in the Navy's arsenal. The F6F Hellcats crouched in rows of blue steel, wings folded like the fists of prize fighters waiting for the bell. When the first engines ignited, the carrier trembled. The deep growl of the Pratt Whitney R-2800 drowned the sea itself. Moments later, the Hellcats clawed into the sky, their first combat sortie. Japanese spotters on Marcus Island sounded the alarm, mistaking the fast-climbing shapes for improved Wildcats. But when the Wildcats rose through anti-aircraft bursts at angles no Wildcat ever could, confusion turned to shock. The new American fighters swept through interceptors with surgical precision, leaving trails of fire where Zero formations once wheeled unchallenged. By November, the Hellcat was everywhere. Over Tarawa and Kwajalein, it roared through the tropical haze, strafing airfields and dueling the best remnants of Japan's naval air force. In the violent skies above Rabaul, ace pilot Edward Butch O'Hare's squadron met veterans of the 201st Kokutai, men who had once trained over China and claimed dominance in every engagement. The Japanese attempted their signature vertical loop, confident in the Zero's climb. But halfway through, the Hellcat simply powered past them, their 3,500-foot-per-minute climb rate turning defense into pursuit. What followed was a massacre in motion. Heavy blue fighters that, as one Kokutai report admitted bitterly, rise like devils and strike from the sun. These encounters marked a shift deeper than tactics. For the first time, Japanese airmen no longer believed in their own invincibility. The Hellcat had shattered the myth of the Zero's supremacy, replacing fear with fury on the American side and disbelief on the Japanese. Within months, its kill ratio soared toward an unprecedented 19-1. The Pacific sky, once Japan's hunting ground, now belonged to Grumman's beast, and the stage was set for its greatest test yet, in the Marianas. By the opening months of 1944, Japan's Naval General Staff finally had a name for the blue fighter tearing apart their air wings: Grumman type. Intelligence officers in Tokyo cataloged photographs from Truk and Palau, noting its broad wings and heavy fuselage, yet dismissed it as merely an improved Wildcat. Confidence still lingered that Japan's lighter, more agile designs held the edge. But frontline reports began to erode that illusion. Surviving pilots from the 201st and 252nd Kokutai wrote of duels that defied logic. The new enemy fighter climbed even when trailing smoke, dove like a stone, and came back for another pass. One shaken aviator described his rounds sparking harmlessly against a blue monster that would not fall. what official analysts in Tokyo saw as statistical noise. The men in cockpits recognized as a new reality. Japan no longer owned the vertical. At Truk Lagoon in February 1944, the Hellcats tore through interceptors trying to protect the anchorage. Radio intercepts captured panicked calls. "It follows in the climb. It cannot be shaken." The notion that a carrier-based fighter, heavier, slower to take off, could outclimb a Zero overturned every expectation formed since 1941. The shock spread beyond Japan's borders. German attachés stationed in Tokyo dispatched urgent assessments to Berlin, comparing the Hellcat's resilience to their own Focke-Wulf FW-190A. To Luftwaffe engineers, the revelation was unsettling. American naval aviation had achieved the ruggedness and combat endurance once thought exclusive to European land-based fighters. For Japan's Air Command, these reports carried a bitter implication. It was no longer a matter of tactics or courage. The Americans had surpassed them in design philosophy itself. Strength over subtlety, survivability over grace. With veteran pilots lost faster than they could be replaced, morale eroded in squadrons that once fought with quiet certainty. The Hellcat was not just an aircraft. It was proof that Japan's industrial miracle had met its end. The Empire's skies were shrinking, and soon its carriers would follow. By 1943, the roar of American industry had become as decisive a weapon as any cannon. At Grumman's Bethpage plant on Long Island, assembly lines thundered day and night, their rhythm marked by the hiss of rivet guns and the clang of steel bulkheads. What began as sketches on a drafting table had become a miracle of mass production. Women in denim overalls, many fresh from offices or farms, riveted fuselages beside returning veterans who traded flight suits for factory gloves. At its wartime peak, the plant turned out one Hellcat every 63 minutes, a staggering tempo that matched Japan's entire monthly fighter output. The factory lights never went dark. Each completed aircraft was rolled directly to waiting flat cars, its nose still warm from final engine tests. Behind every Hellcat stood an army of unseen engineers and suppliers. Pratt & Whitney's East Hartford plant produced the double Wasp engine in thousands, each tested to run hours longer than its rated limits. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics standardized components and maintenance so thoroughly that carrier crews could replace an entire engine block at sea in a single night. Logistics trains snaked from New England foundries to Pacific decks, ensuring that fuel lines, wing spars, and bolts all matched exactly. It was industrial orchestration on a continental scale, a harmony Japan could no longer replicate. Across the ocean, Tokyo's factories faced ruin, bombing raids, aluminum shortages, and fuel-starved supply chains. The Zero's light alloys grew scarce, its replacements poorly machined. Meanwhile, American carriers filled their decks with endless rows of Hellcats, each a symbol of what total mobilization could achieve. The aircraft's true strength wasn't just horsepower or armor, it was the weight of an entire nation working in unison. The Pacific sky had become an assembly line in motion, and every new sortie proved that America's factories had already won the air war. June 19, 1944. Dawn broke clear over the Philippine Sea, the horizon a pale blue flame beneath the rising sun. From the decks of Task Force 58's carriers, 500 Hellcats rolled forward, their engines drumming like distant thunder across the calm. High above, radar screens traced the first incoming waves from Guam and the Japanese fleet. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle where training, technology, and sheer production collided in one catastrophic reckoning. The Japanese launched over 450 aircraft that morning, Zeros, Judys, and Kates, piloted by the last remnants of their pre-war elite and hundreds of hastily trained replacements. They climbed toward the fleet expecting the same old duel of skill and instinct. Instead, radar-guided Hellcats rose to meet them in disciplined formations, guided to the intercept by voice commands from combat information centers below deck. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, flying from USS Lexington, spotted a formation of dive bombers at 20,000 feet, and dove through them with merciless precision, downing 6 in 8 minutes. Across the task force, similar stories unfolded, dogfights that weren't fights at all, but executions at altitude. From the Japanese cockpits came disbelief. Reports from the few survivors spoke of blue monsters that climbed beyond reach and shrugged off gunfire. Even the improved A6M5 Model 52s, lighter and faster than their predecessors, could no longer gain the vertical. The old advantage, the Zero's legendary climb, was gone, erased by the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine and the Americans' radar discipline. By day's end, nearly 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, the greatest one-day loss in naval aviation history. As the surviving Hellcats returned to their carriers, deck crews chalked kill marks on cowlings beneath the fading light. The myth of Japanese aerial supremacy had died over the Marianas, and from that sky of burning wreckage, the path to Japan's defeat became unmistakably clear. In the wake of the Marianas' victory, the Hellcat's shadow stretched across the entire Pacific. By late 1944, the fighter that had once lived only on carrier decks was now roaring from captured island airfields, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, each runway carved from coral and volcanic ash. Where carriers once marked the edge of American reach, the Hellcat now extended it inland, deep into Japan's defensive perimeter. The new F6F5 variant, introduced that spring, brought subtle but decisive refinements, cleaner aerodynamics, refined engine tuning, and a water injection boost system that unleashed bursts of extra power during climbs. Pilots could now surge through tropical thermals at rates exceeding 3,800 feet per minute, their double WASP engines shrieking against the heat-hazed sky. From these forward bases, Hellcats escorted B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses over Formosa, pounced on convoys in the South China Sea, and hammered airfields across the Philippines. Their combat radius, once bound by carrier range, now stretched more than 1,000 miles. Over Leyte and later Luzon, they met Japan's new land-based interceptors, the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank and the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, machines that, on paper, rivaled the Hellcat in speed and climb. Yet even these found the American fighter nearly untouchable above 30,000 feet, where its 2,000 horsepower engine and heavy airframe turned altitude into armor. As the war drew closer to Japan's homeland, the Hellcat became a constant in every sky. Its wings bore the salt of carrier decks and the dust of island strips alike. Pilots spoke of its trustworthiness, a plane that brought them home even when riddled with holes, a guardian that never faltered in storm or combat. From Saipan to Okinawa, the Hellcat had evolved beyond a naval weapon. It had become the embodiment of total air supremacy, carrying the war to Japan's doorstep. Behind every Hellcat that clawed through the Pacific sky stood a pilot forged by the most methodical training system in the world. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had turned aviation instruction into an industrial process of its own, an endless pipeline stretching from Pensacola to Corpus Christi, producing thousands of airmen fluent in deflection shooting, formation discipline, and coordinated strike tactics. Flight instructors drilled cadets to think in 3 dimensions, to fly as teams, and to trust their instruments more than instinct. Each new pilot logged hundreds of hours in simulators and trainers before ever touching a combat deck. The result was not just skill, but uniformity, a corps of aviators who fought with identical precision under any sky. Across the Pacific, Japan faced a different reality. The veterans who had once dominated the skies over China and Pearl Harbor were gone, lost in campaigns from Guadalcanal to Rabaul. In their place came cadets with fewer than 300 flight hours, often barely familiar with formation flying. Their Zeros, while agile, demanded perfection. One mistake meant death. The Hellcat, by contrast, forgave errors. Its wide landing gear, strong wings, and steady controls gave even novice pilots a chance to live through their first fight and learn from it. In the words of one captured Japanese officer, they fight like machines that do not fear death. Confidence became America's invisible weapon. Hellcat pilots trusted their aircraft absolutely. They knew its armor could absorb punishment, its engine could bring them home. More than half of those hit in combat managed to land safely, a survival rate that fed morale and experience with every mission. By late 1944, Japan's air arm wasn't merely losing planes, it was losing belief. The Hellcat had become more than metal and rivets. It was the living emblem of American endurance and unshakable resolve. By the closing months of 1944, Japan's once proud naval air arm had become a shadow of its former self. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had broken its spine. The raids that followed finished the rest. With the Hellcat reigning unchallenged above the Pacific, the American fleet no longer fought for survival. It dictated the tempo of the war. Carriers like Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise launched endless wings of blue fighters that swept ahead of every amphibious landing, clearing the skies before a single transport approached shore. Japan's airfields, from Luzon to Formosa, burned under this relentless pressure. For every Zero or Ki-84 that managed to take off, a dozen Hellcats waited above to strike. The attrition was absolute. Japan could replace neither the machines nor the men. Throughout 1945, as the U.S. advanced toward Okinawa, the Hellcat became the wall between the fleet and destruction. During Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, hundreds of kamikaze pilots hurled their aircraft toward the invasion armada in desperate waves. The Hellcats met them head-on. Flying patrols from dawn until dusk, they intercepted attackers miles from the fleet, often diving straight through exploding wreckage to reach the next target. Over 400 enemy aircraft fell during the Okinawa campaign alone, most credited to Hellcat squadrons. What had begun as a defensive fighter 2 years earlier had become the shield of an empire in reverse, the final expression of American naval power in the air. By mid-1945, the transformation was complete. Japan's skies, once alive with the sharp whine of Zeros, had fallen silent except for the deep growl of Hellcats on patrol. Strategic bombing, naval blockade, and invasion plans all relied on the same truth. The enemy could no longer contest the air. The rules of aerial warfare had been rewritten, and the Hellcat had written them in fire. For all its fearsome reputation, the Hellcat was never without its flaws. Pilots who loved its strength also cursed its weight. At high speeds, the control stick grew heavy, demanding brute force to roll or pull through tight turns. Its broad nose, a byproduct of that powerful double-wasp engine, blocked visibility during carrier landings, an unnerving problem on a pitching deck. Compared to the sleeker F-4U Corsair, the Hellcat felt less agile, slower in roll, more like a hammer than a rapier. In the suffocating heat of the Pacific, idling engines overheated quickly, cooking pilots in the cockpit as deck crews scrambled to launch the next wave. Yet, even these shortcomings became fuel for improvement, not defeat. Grumman's engineers never stopped refining their creation. Field modifications introduced better oil coolers, revised exhausts, and eventually a new bubble canopy that gave pilots a wider field of view. The F6F5 variant added refined aerodynamics and stronger wing spars, preparing the aircraft for heavier ordnance. Then came the F6F5N, the night fighter. Outfitted with the AN/APS-6 radar pod on its starboard wing, it became the Navy's first true carrier-based night interceptor, capable of hunting bombers and kamikazes in total darkness. These radar-equipped Hellcats prowled the night skies above Okinawa and Iwo Jima, guided by blips on glowing cathode screens rather than stars or moonlight. By 1945, the Hellcat had become more than a fighter. It was a workhorse of transformation. Reinforced wings carried 2,000-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets, striking ground targets with the same precision once reserved for air duels. It could escort, intercept, strafe, and bomb with equal confidence. The Zero killer of 1943 had evolved into a multi-role predator by war's end, a machine as adaptable as the nation that built it, embodying the Navy's new creed of dominance through flexibility. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, one aircraft stood above all others as the symbol of naval supremacy, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. In just over 2 years of combat, It had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft, accounting for 3/4 of all aerial victories by U.S. Navy fighters. No other carrier-based aircraft in history had ever achieved such dominance. Across the Pacific, wrecked Zeros lay scattered on coral runways and jungle clearings, mute testimony to the machine that had erased Japan's air arm. Even captured Japanese engineers studying the Hellcat in the war's aftermath admitted a reluctant awe. Its climb rate, armor protection, and forgiving controls defied the minimalist ideals they once considered sacred. The Hellcat's influence did not end with victory. Its philosophy, power before elegance, protection before speed, became the blueprint for a new era of aviation. Grumman carried those lessons forward into the F-8F Bearcat, a smaller, faster evolution that bridged the gap to jet power, and later into the F-9F Panther, the Navy's first operational jet fighter. The engineers who had once designed the Hellcat now shaped the age of swept wings and afterburners. Meanwhile, thousands of veteran Hellcat pilots transitioned into instructors, filling flight schools across America and Europe. Their doctrine of teamwork, precision, and mechanical trust became the foundation of Cold War air strategy. By the time the last frontline Hellcat squadrons were retired in 1954, its silhouette had already entered legend. On museum decks and weathered airfields, its broad wings still spoke of a time when the world's fate was decided over endless stretches of blue water. For Japan, the Zero faded into myth, a ghost of a vanished empire. For America, the Hellcat remained proof that determination, discipline, and industrial might could redefine the very physics of war in the air. The Pacific sky that had once echoed with the shrill cry of the Zero ended in the thunder of the Hellcat's double Wasp engines. What began in 1942 as a desperate struggle for survival had, by 1945, become a triumph of discipline, design, and determination. The same sea lanes where American carriers once fled under fire now swarmed with squadrons of blue fighters, commanding the air with absolute confidence. For Japanese pilots who looked up that June morning over the Philippine Sea and saw the impossible, heavier American machines climbing past them into the sun, it was not merely defeat. It was as if the very heavens had switched allegiance. The Hellcat was more than metal and horsepower. It was the symbol of a nation's ability to learn faster than it could bleed. In its wings lay the story of adaptation, the transformation of weakness into strength, of reaction into mastery. It avenged Pearl Harbor not with vengeance, but with precision and persistence. It silenced the myth of the Zero, ending the age of lightness and grace with one of power and endurance. When its propellers finally spun down on carrier decks at war's end, they left behind a new kind of sky, one ruled not by instinct alone, but by technology, teamwork, and unrelenting will. Even now the Hellcat's shadow lingers there, the iron answer to the legend of the Zero.